Welcome to Hotel Bar Sessions Episode 2. Today's topic, art.
Hey listeners, welcome back. I am joined here today with my co-hosts, Ammon and Leigh. How's it going, guys?
Hey, what's up, Shannon?
Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to hear you. So listeners, as you know, this podcast is structured in such a way that we want to recreate the feeling and energy and excitement and just friendship that forms at the end of a day at a conference where we come together at the hotel bar and shoot the breeze about what we've learned and been thinking about that day in philosophy. So what I'm going to do now is introduce Ammon's topic, which is on art. And I am very excited about this because I have found myself really trying to think through what exactly talk about it now. So Ammon, enlighten us.
I'm not sure if I can enlighten us. Actually, and I wish we actually had drinks right now because I think a lot of folks who work on aesthetics, or maybe this is just me, sometimes I have a little bit of insecurity about that topic. I think some of us philosophers take it very seriously and love it, but a lot of times it's relegated to a corner of the philosophical world. And today I want to defend why I think that's wrong. Sometimes I want to explain why we as philosophers should take art more seriously. And I don't think I want to do that. I actually think I want to talk with you guys about if there are ways in which philosophy would be enriched by playing around with ideas about aesthetic experiences a little more, and by being open to some of the odd ways in which reasoning can work when you start to think about the myriads of aesthetic experiences that are out there and how they intersect with our reasoning.
I'm really excited to hear you approach it this way because I was thinking as I was getting excited to hear what you had to say about art today, that aesthetics and art experiences, it seems to also be a really contentious. It's not just relegated to the corner, but people get really contentious about what counts as art, what counts as an aesthetic experience, who's saying that they are an expert in these kinds of things. And so that's always my trepidation.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Shannon said. I really am excited about this conversation too. And I was really worried about it because I was thinking to myself, I don't know that I could define what art is. And I don't know that I could tell you what an aesthetic experience is. And I also want to say that I'm coming off like just moments ago before we started recording, watching the YouTube video of the recent CPAC. Someone at CPAC sang an atonal polka version of the National Anthem. And my first thought was, I should ask Ammon if there's any art that should be banned, because if there is, that's it. And is this even art?
So I haven't seen that yet. Were they intentionally doing an atonal polka version, or did it?
Yeah, they were matching it to the girl who was singing the anthem, and so they would change it according to whatever minor or major chord or tempo that she goes to. It's brilliant. There's like acapella renditions of it. People have just done all sorts of ways of which is actually, I was thinking sort of the same thing, Leigh, right? Taking this complete disaster of a presentation of the American anthem and doing something to it that maybe makes it art.
Wait a minute. Okay, sorry, but no, the video of it is actually how it was performed at
the
CPAC.
polka?
Yes. It was not, that was not
the
CPAC.
polka?
Yes. It was not, that was not a meme. That was not
That's real?
a remix. That is actually how it was performed. And it is.
Wait, but not to polka music.
Yes. What you heard is what was performed at the CPAC convention.
What was the rationale?
I'm going to bring it up and maybe play a little bit.
Let's play some of that. That'll be fun.
But, but then in that case, then she's a genius because she matched the music.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't buy it. All right. Sorry, Ammon. We're going to have to just pause.
This is much more important. No, actually,
I have to see this polka rendition.
Let me know, Leigh, let me know when you're ready. But while we're waiting here, actually, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is it's funny because I think that oftentimes we think of the paradigmatic question of the esthetician. And I think it's really funny that you guys are like, oh, I'm intimidated to talk. Maybe my insecurity is just that we're the mean kids. I don't know, right? It's like why I find that to be a less productive question one of the things that I'm really interested in aesthetics is what I talk about as anti-normative or non-normative judgments. But I think we're going to have a normative judgment in a second here because we might have to say that this is not. But I have not heard it yet. So
okay, so let me just say that I'm wrong. Shannon's right. I'm now looking at it, and it is someone who basically recreated the music along with what apparently was this just completely atonal, terrible version of the national anthem. But I am going to play it for everyone.
I'm very curious. I've not heard this yet, so
I'm just going to play it all the way through. Feel free to comment as we go through. So, all right, here we go.
Now I'm bummed it wasn't.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight?
So, who is she? Whoa.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. It gets better. It gets better.
And bright stars through the perilous fight.
I love that Leigh thought
There's a
that
nice
this
tempo.
was actually how it was performed. No, it was really performed like this according to polka music.
You guys, this is that.
Whoa. We just had like 4 key changes there.
Having an aesthetic experience. I'm having an out-of-body aesthetic.
Oh, wow. We're intensifying here.
Doubling down.
My ears are bleeding.
How long is this?
My brain is bleeding.
Bring it home. Bring it home.
Believe in yourself.
And the hope of love
Thunderous applause.
Wow. Well,
I mean, it's an experience.
Explain how that is art.
So,
It's an experience.
asking whether or not that's art is, I think, maybe less.
It's an experience.
Asking whether or not that's art is, I think, maybe less instructive than asking the question, how does it function as art? Or an even better question, given the fact that people can remix it, that we can sit here and talk about it, what are the ways in which even, let's say, failed performances function in how we think through our shared public spaces? Is that taking place in this performance here? What was CPAC thinking?
Okay, I have a question that I think maybe dovetails with that. I imagine that the people sitting in the audience at CPAC who heard the original version of her singing that might have thought, this is just a bad version of the national anthem, right? This is a bad piece of art. This is a bad musical performance. And the experience of that she was trying to be creative or creatively atonal or play with this very familiar tune, but that she just sang it badly. Like if I looked at a bad painting, now that I know that the sort of polka, the atonal polka remix is something that someone else did, I think that is art. And that my whole aesthetic experience changed by knowing the context of this performance. So that to me is interesting. And I'm wondering if what I'm describing, originally when I heard it, I was like, oh, this is painful. My ears are bleeding. When I heard this is just a terrible rendition of the national anthem. And then later found out that it's this really clever, ironic memeing of this terrible rendition of the national anthem, that I'm having a totally different aesthetic experience. Is it just an aesthetic experience? That has
That's the
changed
wrong
there.
question.
I'm here for the wrong questions.
I'm still floored that Leigh thought that it was originally performed to atonal polka music, because that would make her the best singer and the best performance of the national anthem that has ever happened. Just, no, guys, really, it really was to polka music.
I'm simultaneously humiliated and proud of myself.
I feel the same for you. I really want to see if I get the gist of Leigh's question, because it was what I was thinking too. When you first hear the national anthem, it's awful the way she performs it. And you would just say, maybe the anthem itself is a work of art as a song, but the performance was a complete. When you hear it put into polka music and you see the kind of creativity that frames it, it suddenly becomes more of what we might call a work of art. And the experience itself completely changes.
Yeah, because the context matters. And I think one of the questions that comes out of this, when we turn to something, we say, is this a work of art? We seem to have some sort of background theory about what it is that things that are works of art are supposed to do for us. So when they invited this person to perform at CPAC, she was performing a certain ritual that's a staple of political and public life in America, and which she performed badly. Who knows why she performed it badly? We won't get into that question. But she was performing a certain ritual, and we judge that as a failure. But as you guys are pointing out, the interesting thing about a failure is that a failure can, in the context of a larger public conversation, go in lots of other directions. And so one of the questions that comes out of this, well, why do... But as you guys are pointing out, the interesting thing about a failure is that a failure can, in the context of a larger public conversation, go in lots of other directions. And so one of the questions that comes out of this, well, why do we care so much about aesthetic experiences? What do we mean when we think we call an aesthetic experience good? And why are we so obsessed with the question of whether it's good or bad? Is it art or not? Why do these kinds of questions animate us as much as they seem to?
So, Ammon, if I am hearing the way that you're talking about this, it seems to me that you really don't want to ask the question or talk about what is art, what makes something art, that you're not really...
I think it's a fair question. First of all, I'm sort of a maximalist in my answer to that. I'm willing to grant that just about anything can be taken as a work of art.
See, I don't like that answer.
I know.
Yeah. I don't like that answer, because I like the possibility that maybe object or entity or product. I want to hear you talk more about that, but I'm concerned about I will count almost anything as art.
Well, let me ask you, if you're concerned about it, what are you hoping that art does for you?
I think that reply question is not really getting at Shannon's concern. Let's imagine that she was not singing a song, but that she had written a really bad essay and someone else took it and put it in a structure where now whatever she wrote, which was supposed to be an exam essay, is actually funny and seems creative and weirdly brilliant because it's put in a different context. And I would say that we've taken something that in its original context was serious but poorly executed. We put it in a different context. And so what has happened there is, I don't know what I would call it, even like comedy. And maybe comedy is an aesthetic experience. But what I think both Shannon and I want to say marks the transition between an aesthetic experience of her just singing a song badly and that song being recontextualized in a way that it becomes a different art performance. It becomes a different performance of a song. Yeah. So in that sense, it doesn't matter that she's singing a song.
Well, so yeah, when I say that I'm willing to count just about anything as art, that's very different than saying I think that everything is art. Arthur Danto, who I tend to agree with on this issue, he has what he talks about as this aboutness theory of art. And essentially all it is for something to be a work of art, it has to make a claim in the context of a or the, and we can talk about whether or not that difference matters, art world. So an essay isn't a work of art, but if you contextualize it as a song, it becomes one. Even when she's performing the national anthem badly, the reason why it's a work of art is because it is being done, as I said earlier, as a ritual or as in a context in which we're celebrating we're engaging in a thing that we all understand to be art, and she's making a claim or performing something in that context. That's all it has to be, right? So that doesn't so the point is that anything could be art, but that doesn't mean that anything is art. Shannon, you're not happy with this answer.
Well, help me understand this then. It seems to me that you are pushing the public or shared or social element that comes with the question of what makes something art or an aesthetic experience.
So first of all, art or an aesthetic experience, that's an important qualification. Ontologically, I think those overlap a lot. I'm not sure they're ontologically identical. I just want to footnote that for now.
Fair.
But go ahead.
And so you're talking about this sort of ritual and that puts it in some kind of art context.
Yeah.
And that therefore we talk about it as a work of art and or an aesthetic experience.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because I would want to say that not all of our ritualized practices are art. I think that in this case, it's because it's a song and not because it's this ritualized practice of patriotism. I wouldn't say that when people stand up and recite the Pledge of Allegiance,
right?
If somebody flubbed that, I wouldn't say all the things that I'm saying about that experience.
Yeah, agreed. And so the reason why I was saying that this is art is because it's a ritual performance of something that we take to be art. You're right. We can have other rituals that are not art. And crucially, one key thing to keep in mind is that a lot of things that we call art now weren't art 400 years ago. And
like memes.
Like memes. Well, also like a lot of rituals. So art has a meaning in the context of our world. We have a thing that we understand and we place a lot of things in that would have been placed into other categories or other boxes 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago.
Can you give me an example of something that is considered art now that would not have been considered art 500 years ago? And don't say a meme, because I think that that's still in the realm of visual arts.
Stone knife. 100,000 years ago, a stone knife is not art. I can now go look at it and talk about the artisan who made the stone art, right? I would even say the paintings in Lascaux or wherever the hell Werner Herzog goes. It's not just a nominalist game to say the folks who are doing that, as far as we know, were not engaged in art making in the way that we understand the term, but we now take that to be art. But that's why I think the stone knife is better. A lot of ritual objects from around the world existed in the context of specific worlds where they've performed certain roles, a lot of times religious roles, and modern secular society categorizes those as art objects.
Okay, I have a follow-up question then, because it seems to me that we consider the stone knife an artwork, and this is a whole nother set of questions that I want to ask later, but we consider it an artwork because we put it in a museum, and that's the sort of frame of let's look at this as an artwork. And we could take things that in our actual lives are not considered artworks, like a toilet, and put it in a museum, and it's going to be an artwork, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is, forgive me because I really feel dumb asking this question, but it's
it's okay.
Genuine question coming from a pure place. The question is, other than things that broadly fall in the category of the visual arts, dance, music, really only those, other than those categories, broadly speaking, plus anything that we put in a museum, is it the case that there are things now that we consider art that were not considered art 500 years ago?
I feel like you're saying, other than the things that we consider art now that we didn't consider art 500 years ago, what would be something else that we consider art now that we didn't consider art 500 years ago? And I'm not just trying to be flip, but the point is that when you say, well, it's because we put it in a museum, I think there's a lot of stuff in the category of performance art that would fit in this category. And with music, too. So, for example, rises of sampling technologies drastically changed what people were willing to count as music. And, the rise of noise music did similar things 30 or 40 years ago. But it was in the context of the world in which we talked about something as being music. We added new things in. But other than the things that we added in, I guess that's where I'm
which is that it seems to me that you're willing to say that, you did actually say that anything can be art. I think that it is possible that changing the sort of cultural and intellectual contexts in the same way that putting something in a museum can make something art, that certain cultural and contextual changes can make something emerge as an art form as the understanding of art changes. When do you think art as a thematic category arose in human experience, in human history? Because you said there are things that we consider art now that we wouldn't have considered 500 years ago, like a stone knife, right? If you had said there are things that we consider art now that we wouldn't have considered 3,000 years ago, like a stone knife, I would say that's because they didn't have a concept of art.
Right. Yeah. So am I just engaged in a nominalist game here?
Right.
That's a fair question. And back to Shannon's point, when I said, let's be careful about art versus aesthetics, I'm pretty heavily nominalistic about what I'll count as art for reasons that relate to what I think about this next issue. But part of that has to do with what my theory of aesthetic experience is, which is why I'd asked you, Shannon, earlier, and you too also, Leigh, when you're saying this is or isn't art, what's that doing for you? I actually think if we trace modern aesthetics back to Kant, I think that that's the first question of modern aesthetics is, well, what's that doing for you? And so that's why I want to come back to that question.
Well, so let's come back to that question, because ever since you asked it, I've been thinking to myself, trying not just to reduce it to some sort of Kantian answer, but I've been thinking to myself, and in the way that we've been talking about that, what does art do? And having a really hard time figuring out what art does that doesn't bleed over into other kinds of experiences. So when I hear music, I feel, and having a really hard time figuring out what art does that doesn't bleed over into other kinds of experiences. So when I hear music, I feel perhaps the quickening. I feel connection to a larger community. I feel like there is something that is being sparked in me that no other kind of experience can give to me. But then I think, well, sometimes when I read a really good philosophical essay, I have similar kinds of experiences. Or when I have a really great conversation with a friend or my co-hosts, I have similar experiences. And so I'm just giving a sort of sincere response to what you asked early on, which is what does it do for you? And I'm having a really hard time drawing boundaries.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that to me is the really interesting question, is why is it so hard to draw those boundaries? But also, why does that boundary matter so much to us? Right?
It does matter.
Also, why does that boundary matter so much to us? Right?
It does matter.
Because I do think it does matter. It really matters. And my nominalism about art is exactly because I think it matters so much. But
okay, so why does it matter? Like let's ask that question to you, since you're in the hot seat. This is your episode about your wheelhouse. Why is the aesthetic experience so important to us, and why is it important that we have boundaries for identifying those experiences?
So I'm going to apologize. My answer is going to involve a slight detour through the history of philosophy. And the tradition that I'm part of, the Heideggerian tradition that I'm a part of, has no problem making grand utterances about the history of philosophy. And I want to sort of bookmark that I want to be really careful with those. That said, I think it's fair to say that when we retrospectively talk about this thing called the history of philosophy, there is a huge chunk of the history of philosophy that has not only been comfortable of, but has been actively productive of an exclusion of questions about art and aesthetics as not properly philosophical. Now, this often gets traced back, of course, primarily to Plato, who is interesting about it because he actually makes this explicit. But the shorthand version of this, and I admit this is a bit of a straw man, is philosophy is nothing but arguments. Our arguments are adjudicated by rational activity. To use Kantian categories, you need reason, the understanding, and judgment, and you can resolve most of the kinds of problems that we talk about through those things. That's it, right? We can resolve normative questions that way about ethics. We can resolve political questions that way. Scientific questions we resolve through empirical means and using the categories of reason. And art is subjective, and we're terrified of subjective things. So I think that there's a huge chunk of philosophical discourse that has been very comfortable excluding the question of aesthetic experiences. Now, I personally am persuaded, for a lot of reasons that would involve going through Kant and decide one way and not another way, is covert aesthetic commitments that they are not fully honest about or cognizant of. So I think that by excluding questions about art from philosophy, we're removing from the court of conversation a lot of the grounds by which we negotiate some of our deepest and our most closely held commitments, but also our deepest disagreements with one another.
If I hear you correctly, you're saying that the sort of exclusion of the question of art, largely because it does involve subjective experience, is problematic because that might actually tell us a lot about other kinds of interesting philosophical problems, not just problems about the question of what makes an aesthetic experience.
Yeah, but that becomes important because it helps us understand how aesthetic experience works, right?
So let's get to it. In my naive response of what I think of I have happened to me and what it is that I seek out in an aesthetic experience, why is that not what you're getting at?
It might be.
What are you? Okay, so then what are you getting at?
Well,
What is an aesthetic experience?
Let's go back to our poor CPAC singer for a second. I feel so bad because I really I want to do nothing more than run away from it, but we keep on being drawn back to it. When I say it had an aesthetic value, it involved a way, presumably, of performing a certain kind of secular religion that we relegate to art to do, but also trying to draw people together around shared collective norms. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that people who are making fun of this person, and for good reasons, and making better art because of it, also are doing so on grounds of shared normative judgments. So the most common answer given to this question, and I love this answer, but it's complicated for me in ways that we can talk about, but the most common answer to the question is, well, we seek out these aesthetic experiences because these are ways in which we coordinate our subjective lives and ways in which we line up our shared norms with one another. So we're affirming certain values, and by affirming those values, we're making it possible to share the world in certain ways. I think that in the post-Kantian tradition, and again, this already starts in Kant, most of the answers given to that question are some variation on that answer.
All right, I like this. So it's a very dynamic conception too, because I can see as different groups and different art forms and different people who are exploring with new ways of poetic or poiesis expression, that they would be sort of these ripples that are coming together and forming different kinds of communities and shared norms that are always in emergence, always coming into new forms all the time. And that makes it a really dynamic and exciting and lively notion. I guess my question to you would be, what if I, using my computer, write a song and it's just me and I'm breaking all kinds of norms and I just listen to it and play it for myself and I'm not involving any kind of shared ritual or shared experience or communal outreach? Is that still on the same?
No other reason, just in the fact that you called it a song.
Yeah, it's still part of a world. Even if you're not sharing it with other people, it's still part of a shared world.
All right.
Now, I mean, we get into this question, and I think it's an interesting one, although it's a tougher one. Is there a truly unique private universe or world? That's a different question, I think. But yeah, I think the point is it doesn't have to be shared at every moment to be part of a shared world.
I really like this explanation, Ammon, because it explains to me how people can have a shared aesthetic experience around what other people call bad art. So just to pick a really obvious punching bag here, reality television, which I know that you and I both really love.
Yeah.
That is something that produces a community. It's something that's shared.
Okay, so I just do not. We're going to say reality television. I guess it's art because we consider cinema
that is something that produces a community. It's something that's shared.
I just do not. We're going to say reality television. I guess it's art because we consider cinema and television just by itself, by virtue of the fact that it's a category, that anything that falls under that category is art.
It's storytelling.
Yeah. And sometimes it's artful storytelling. I think one of the Bachelor camera people does great work. It's one specific person, too. Especially on Bachelor in Paradise, one of the camera people, they will do these lingering shots on crabs in the ocean. It really adds to the storytelling. So there's, not only is it art, I don't even know if it's bad art, there's artfulness to it in certain ways.
All right, fine. I buy it.
Now that I mentioned crabs, you're like, okay. No,
You're
but
right, it's storytelling.
But I think the point, yeah, I think that there are shared meaning-making activities that take place around it.
Okay.
Making activities that take place around it.
Okay, so then what is the difference between that shared meaning-making activity and writing laws or discussing politics?
Yeah, one of my arguments would be we have in our world created a certain space that we say, here's where we're willing to talk about aesthetic experiences. To be clear, I don't think that that's the only place those aesthetic experiences or aesthetics matters. So part of my argument would be that there are aesthetic components to these things, but I'm not trying to make the claim that that all ways of making meaning involve what I'm calling here aesthetics or involve what I'm calling art. The main claim that I would want to defend is that when we look at how we end up ultimately adjudicating what kinds of reasons we find persuasive, or in the case of law, what kinds of values we find worth instantiating, we are very often overlooking the extent to which it relies on aesthetic judgments. And the point of aesthetic experience is to force us to think about those judgments more carefully. And that's true even in laws.
All right, so I want to ask a different kind of question. Once something has been produced in such a way that it is art or it is an aesthetic experience, can it ever stop doing that?
Yeah, that's what a cliche is. Cliches and memes. Let's talk about the national anthem some more. And I feel bad that we keep on coming back.
No, don't feel bad. Embrace it. We are going all the way in on this.
So here will be our first controversy where we get canceled by the right on this podcast, which I'm sure will happen many times.
I think that's just already a priori the case.
I already feel relief having known that.
Most performances of the national anthem are banal cliches, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And had this particular performer done not quite so awfully, it would have fallen into the genre of banal cliches. Most of the time, we negotiate the world engaging with banal cliches. You're not engaging with it in any way aesthetically. That's what the cliche is, though, yeah. But you can. It's always latent there, yeah.
I want to go back then, because I thought that when we first started discussing this, the idea was, when Leigh asked the question, it's a bad performance, and we would recognize it as a bad performance, which I think you're now saying is a banal cliche, but it's still a bad performance of art.
Yeah.
So it's not just that. I mean, my question was, can something stop being art? And you're like, yeah, when it becomes a cliche. And then we have a lot of sort of cliche, banal performances of the national at boring, banal, cliche art.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. Yeah,
sorry. I want to jump in here because this is actually really interesting to me, because I think it's clarifying something about why I like karaoke performances so much.
All right.
And it really is, in many ways, exhibited in this particularly bad performance of the national anthem. So one of the things that I really love when I go and watch karaoke, like at a bar, remember back when we could do those things?
Vaguely.
The before times.
The before times is actually not the people who are great singers who perform the song either exactly like it sounds on the radio or just perfectly sung. And not the people who are boring or bad or cliche karaoke singers, but the ones who are so bad that it actually becomes a whole different experience. My experience is that now it's not just about the song and like, are they hitting all the notes that they're supposed to hit, but it's about this other experience, which is about loving a song so hard that you're going all in on it, even if you can't carry a tune in a bucket. And there's something about that gets it out of the banal cliche of just simply repeating something that I've heard many, many, many times, and becomes this whole other different art experience. This is one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this bad performance of the national anthem, is that it's not just a bad performance. It's so bad that it becomes a whole new, different piece of art. And so now I'm not just, and Shannon's laughing at me, but
I'm
now
just laughing. It was originally to polka, and I'm never going to get over it.
I did. But now I see that there is a whole different thing that's going on here. And my experience, actually, when I listen to that, is not an experience of hearing the national anthem.
No,
it is something else, right?
So I love two things that you said that I'm going to adopt as core aesthetic commitment. One was loving it so hard. What I wanted to complain about today in way too philosophy of a way was how much even my fellow aestheticians are obsessed with normative judgment. And the way that I put it now is what I'm really much more interested in, when can we all agree something is good, is why do some people love something so hard? And what does that loving thing so hard do for them? So there's that. And then there's also, you said at the end, it becomes a whole other thing. So first of all, I should say, back to your point, Shannon, you're right. Even banal art on my account is still art. What I was trying to say, and I had conflated the two things, was that we're engaging with it as art, but we're not engaging with the way as much of a role. But it still functions in certain ways as art. And that's true, I think, again, back to your point about karaoke, which I also love. And in a second, I want to know what both of your guys' go-to karaoke songs would be right now if we were able to do karaoke.
Ooh, yes.
Is that people are trying to mine something out of the cliche. They're taking songs that are exactly incredibly recognizable. And even if they want to perfectly mimic it, and even if they do successfully in certain ways, there's a function that that's doing for them that is irreducible to what's taking place in the original. And that's what makes karaoke so wonderful, is you're seeing all these worlds coming together. And I miss karaoke so much.
I love this idea of tying the question of aesthetics and aesthetic experience to the question of worlds and shared worlds. And I think that this is provocative and it's important and it's really, I don't need to go too hard into this, but how is that different than other ways that we share worlds? But I can't help but still want to know, is it just a difference in degree, or is there a difference in kind in the world sharing that happens in art versus other ways that we share worlds? Institutions.
Right.
I want to just note for the record here, just put this in your pocket, that I do want to get back to the question of which karaoke song is your go-to.
It's a very important question. I've got an answer, but I've got several answers. I think, Shannon, that there's a lot of overlap. One of the reasons why I personally love questions about aesthetics is I think that there is the possibility in thinking about aesthetic experience to understand how we share worlds without our norms converging. And the world is an incomplete concept, the way in which we inhabit multiple worlds that we're trying to make sense of as a shared world gets into a lot of important questions about modernity and democracy that I don't think other ways of sharing a world do. And this gets back to my complaint about the Kantian tradition. Kant wants to show how you can engage in a normative thinking in aesthetic judgment that's like the normative thinking in ethics. And so he wants to find ways of conflating them. And I think that that is the norm in philosophical discussions of aesthetics, to the detriment of philosophical discussions of aesthetics. I'm very interested in weird aesthetic experiences. And I think that weird aesthetic experiences matter philosophically in a way that we don't pay enough attention to.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I like that.
I have a question which is a little bit of a pivot, but I'd like to talk just for a minute, about the role of the artist And I know that you guys are going to see this coming from a mile away. So let me just go ahead and state that in the background to this question is, why is it the case that people don't think that AI can create art? And I think that part of the reason is because of the contemporary presumption that machine systems are not artists. However, I do 100% believe that the artwork that we see produced by machine systems right now is just as good, just as interesting, and can produce the same kind of aesthetic experience that we're talking about, whether it's music or the visual arts or whatever, until someone is told that a computer made it. As you both know, my partner is an artist, and this is an argument that we have a lot about the role of the artist and whether or not what we call creativity is something that has to originate in some kind of a human action, whether intentional or not. So that's my question. How important is the artist to aesthetic experience? That's my main question. But the sort of background question is, do you think that artificial intelligence produces art?
So I will admit that I have not seen much AI-produced art that I care much about. But you are much more up on it than I am, so you're going to have to send me your best stuff. But in principle, absolutely, right? I have no reason to think that AI could, and even sort of presently constituted AI couldn't produce art. But on my account, the much more important question is, how is a work of art fitting into a world? And I struggle to understand the world of AI and the world that AI has. And so that's where my hesitation comes from. In principle, I've got no problem with it, but that's where my hesitation comes from.
Let me ask you the same question in a sort of simpler way. Like, who's your favorite composer?
Oh, I mean, I hate favorite composer. I mean, like, I love so many, but let's take Olivier Messiaen, who I like a lot right now, right?
Okay, so because it's music, right, we could feed all of Messiaen's compositions into an AI system, and an AI system could produce a new artwork, a new composition that if you did not know that an AI produced it, you could listen to it and say, oh, this is a Messiaen composition that I've never heard before. And my question is that you would, I presume, have the same aesthetic experience that you have when you listen to Messiaen. I think also, because of what you just said, that if I then told you, oh, actually, that was a composition that was produced by feeding all of Messiaen's compositions into an AI, and actually an AI produced that the experience that you had listening to it after knowing that would be a different experience. And my question is, would you call the second experience an aesthetic experience? Because that would seem that the role of the human artist is very important if the second experience is not an aesthetic experience.
So, I mean, to a certain degree, I don't think you can separate this from the question of the forgery. And that's specific to the example that you're talking about. A forgery is still a work of art. If you've made a computer that can do a good forgery of any artist, that's interesting. And I might really enjoy it. However, if I'm interested in artist X so to stick with Messiaen, for example, I'm interested in the way in which he's moving beyond the kind of statement that he's trying to make in the context of the development of 20th century classical music. I do not think that a forgery advances that conversation. So it's not doing something for me, but it might be really good to listen to.
So I like where this conversation is going. I want to ask it from a different perspective.
Yeah.
So what about a non-human animal, like when the elephants paint? It's not a forgery. It's not a whole catalog being fed into a machine and having it reconstitute the similar kind of music or something, or a similar story. It's an elephant painting a picture. Is that art, even though it's not produced by a human being?
No, but it could be cool to look at, and we can treat it as art, and it might be elephant art. But are we interacting with it in a way which the elephant is contextualizing its experience is meaningful for us in the same way that it is for the elephant?
Why do you hate elephants, Ammon?
But now,
because
but
they're
now
just
you're,
trampling on ours. They think
but now it does seem that you're really hanging a lot on the artist, because I would say that art produced by AI is not a forgery either. It's no more of a forgery than a karaoke performance is a forgery.
Well, it depends on what you're doing with it, right? If you're telling me this was a Beethoven and it was AI Beethoven, then that's a forgery. If you're telling me, oh, hey, this was done in the style of Beethoven, then it's not a forgery.
Yeah, but now we're not talking about the aesthetic experience. We're talking about a certain kind of epistemological judgments. Like, can you identify
Right.
whatever? But it seems to me that Shannon's question and my question are actually quite parallel, that if we're just talking about the experience, I just put a painting in front of you. You don't know if an elephant made it, or a 5-year-old made it, or if Picasso made it.
Yeah.
If I just let you listen to something, you don't know if Messiaen made it, if a computer system made it, or if the wind chimes next door made it. So nature made it. You're going to have what I think you would call an aesthetic experience. But once I tell you the identity of the artist, in some of those cases, you're going to say, now we're not talking about something like an aesthetic experience. We're talking about a forgery, or we're talking about some meaning production that I have no access to because it's the meaning of the world, the elephant meaning or nature meaning or something like that. And that seems to me that now it does sound like you're hanging a lot on the artist.
So I want to be careful. I agree with you guys about the aesthetic experience. So in terms of AI, I'm mostly familiar with this with like snippets of text from various chatbots, some of which are quite chatbots, some of which are quite beautiful in various ways, really do produce certain aesthetic experiences. So yes, that can absolutely happen. And I'm willing to grant that. One of the things that I was trying to get at, and why I care as a philosopher so much about aesthetic experience, is because I think aesthetic experience reveals features of the way in which we create worlds and the way in which we interact with worlds that other kinds of experience don't. So understanding that depends on a lot more context than one individual work of art. It depends on understanding how this work of art fits together into a much bigger web of experiences of the world. And in the case of AI and in the case of the elephant, I don't have that context. That doesn't mean that it's a worse aesthetic experience, though. It just means there's less I can do with it.
I mean, this is just a straightforwardly Kantian question then. So when you hear birdsong, are you having an aesthetic
elephant? I don't have that context. That doesn't mean that it's a worse aesthetic experience, though. It just means there's less I can do with it.
I mean, this is just a straightforwardly Kantian question then. So when you hear birdsong, are you having an aesthetic experience?
Yes.
I don't see how birdsong in an elephant painting is different.
They're not.
Well,
yeah.
Especially when you go into the Kantian example of when they found out that the birdsong was being made by a human, it was no longer perceived as beautiful, but just as annoying, even though it was still sort of work of art.
It's a forgery.
It's a forgery.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. Kant's wrong about that. I agree.
I mean, Ammon, why is there anything wrong with saying, no, this is a human thing? And elephants and AI just don't get to have this experience that I'm calling an aesthetic experience, or they're not producing art in the way I'm talking about art and thinking about it, but it's still not art.
So it's still not art. I'll be clear about that. The elephant, the AI might be art, because that depends on this question of how is it produced in the context of the world. But again, remember what I mean by art is it's the thing that makes a claim in the context of an art world. I'm fine saying that elephants and AI might have aesthetic experiences because I think that it's connected to sensory systems. I'm more confident in the case of the elephant than AI. But again, like in principle, I'm willing to grant either, right?
How is birdsong making a claim in the context of an art world?
It's an aesthetic experience, but it's not a work of art. That's where Con and I agree.
Yeah, it seems to me that going back to one of the original questions that we were asking, and you were saying, I don't want to conflate aesthetic experience and works of art because there's very clear distinctions. And it seems to me that really the work of art, whether it's a stone knife in a museum or it's this polka rendition of the National Anthem, emerges from a shared human experience of the world or worlds. And an aesthetic experience is a much larger, broader category, so that you can have aesthetic experience with nature and with artificial intelligence and with all sorts of other kinds of phenomena.
The really interesting question that comes out of that, though, the way that you make the distinction there, is I don't think it's in principle impossible that we couldn't share elements of the world with both elephants and AI. But just taking them as works of art in the way that humans make works of art actually forecloses that. I need to understand that it's a very different kind of meaning-making activity if I ever want to have a shared experience with an elephant or a whale or AI. I think that those things might be possible, but they're not possible if I don't foreground the very different world that those kinds of beings probably inhabit. And then you know this question, well, how do you share those worlds? Which I think is a fascinating question.
Okay, I want to kind of give you a break from the hotness of the hot seat for a second and sort of tee up a question for you. So what has centering aesthetic experience in the way that you've been talking about it done for your own thinking?
So two things. So one, although I'm a professional philosopher, I love, and I think this is with one of the three of us are friends, we have broad interests, and I think a lot of philosophers do, right? I love literature and music and mythology. I love as passionately as I love philosophy. And so for me, these are just intrinsically valuable things. In terms of what I'd call my philosophical project, I really want to hang a lot on what I'm calling here non-normativity. I think one of the fundamental problems is we're now trying to understand the system of exclusions that have taken place in philosophy and in the West, in part through philosophical discourse. We need to understand the way in which we've prioritized and privileged agreement through shared convergent norms and likenesses. And for me, aesthetic experience generally and modernist art in particular have been very valuable ways of trying to break the hold of that strong normativity. The philosophers I love the most talking about art, Derrida, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Blanchot, probably just those four. I see this sort of counter-tradition within the Kantian tradition of philosophers who are very explicit and say, you know what, the things that I'm talking about might just be weird and idiosyncratic to me. And I'm not trying to develop some sort of shared convergent set of norms. I'm engaging with a certain ecstatic experience of the world because I think it gives me a different way of understanding it. And
so that was awesome, Ammon. And as we are nearing the end of our fabulous discussion on art, I think given what you just said, you have to go first and tell us what would be your go-to karaoke song at this moment in your life.
So my go-to karaoke song, and I still sing it to myself at least once a week, even though no one's around, I sing it to the babies, is Thunder Road in the style of Tom Waits. Oof. And I
he knows how to bring a bar down.
I do, yeah. And I miss going into the bar where everyone wants to sing the popular things and just queuing up the most lugubrious, growly, take my hand, that that I possibly can. I miss it so much. Yeah.
What about you, Leigh?
In fact, man.
Oh, that's good.
But I think now, if I was going to a bar, just because I've missed karaoke so much, that I might be inclined to do one of the songs that I usually hate because they're done so often at karaoke bars, like, Sweet Caroline or Brown Eyed Girl or something that like really gets the whole crowd sort of singing with you. Just because
that's your national anthem is Sweet Caroline.
Ba ba ba. What about you, Shannon?
Y'all, I don't really do karaoke. I don't do the reality television and I don't do karaoke. So this shared world is so limited in this case. But I guess, I don't know, maybe Hold On. I think that would get the crowd going. Some Journey.
Oh, hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
That's a good one. Yeah, Journey.
I've been in the hot seat for a while and I'm sweating. So I need a little break. And I'm going to ask you guys to let me know one place where we're in agreement and one place where you think I need to think one place where we're in agreement and one place where you think I need to think it through here. Leigh, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have any sort of hard disagreements with what you said. And like some of that I'm going to admit is because I really need to kind of sit with a lot of what you said some more. But I would say that I do agree with what I take to be your original point, which was that the question of aesthetic experience and what aesthetic experience does for us is much more important than questions about what is or isn't art, or the determination of any sort of normative standards that aesthetic experiences ought to provide for us. I think maybe where I disagree is, and again, I'm not even sure this is a disagreement because I'm not entirely positive where you came down on this question, but is whether or not this is a thoroughly human experience. Like, can we talk about artists? Can we talk about art? Can we talk about aesthetic experience outside of the context of the sensus communis?
It's fair question.
Yeah, I think that I share a similar agreement insofar as I think that the way that you talk about shared worlds without convergent norms is a really fecund way to think about what aesthetic experience is. And I think that that's actually something that I'm going to take forward when I try to teach aesthetics, which I find to be some of the most difficult philosophy to teach. I think I'm more persuaded about art being produced by humans, and I'm kind of disappointed that you didn't bring up the muses. I guess where I'd want to push you a little bit is just where there was that moment where we talked about having an aesthetic experience of what we think to be a work of art. And then we discover that, in fact, it's not produced by a human, and it's either a forgery or a fake, or it's just some kind of facsimile. And what is the status then of that experience? And what is the status of the object that we have that experience of? So I'm not really disagreeing with you. I'd like to push you a little bit more on those discrepancies.
We'll have to talk some more later then. More drinks.
More drinks.
Yeah, and for our listeners, if you've got things to say about art, about aesthetic experience, or about Ammon's really terrible karaoke choices, please get in contact with us. We have a Facebook page. It's Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast. Also, you can find us on Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast, or you can visit our website, hotelbarsessions.com.
Our next podcast, Leigh is going to be the hot seat. And I think, Leigh, you're going to be talking about, I'm going to guess, tech?
Yeah. I feel like that's what I've been talking about all along. But
She's only going to talk about AI producing painting.
Emergent technologies, and hopefully about why I think these are the most important philosophical questions right now. So really excited to have that conversation with you guys next time.
Awesome.
All right, we got last call at the hotel bar. I'll catch you guys on the flip side.